Ooh. Okay, so hello everyone. I want to introduce you to Simon Cox, who is at CSIRO in Melbourne. And I'm happy that you're here, Simon. He has a wealth of experience with standards and sort of building vocabularies. So I'm hoping we can leverage your experience with our questions later and as a follow-up. So here, take it away, Simon.
Okay, I will try and find the right screen here. On the right screen now?
Yep, you're good.
Good. I'll move my little pictures of you guys off to the side. So I've got this presentation. It's actually in Google Slides, so I can share it for people to pillage it and look at it in their own time if they really feel like it. I guess this presentation sort of emerged out of the conversations we'd had with the group, where from time to time I'd logged in and said, oh, we got this way of dealing with it with this ontology and these vocabularies, and some people who weren't already aware of that, some people are, some people aren't, asked for a bit of an intro. So and I said, well, if I'm introducing SOSA, then I also need to talk about SSN extensions and also probably the TERN Ontology. So that's what's been advertised. I've given it a more sort of expressive title, Domain Independent Models for Encoding Observation Data, than with the sort of advertised title as a subtitle there. But the outline is that I'm going to talk about O&M, which wasn't in that original title, but is the sort of background, the origin story of these ontological implementations. Then sort of my outline of how O&M is implemented in SOSA and SSN, not in great detail because there's other documents and specifications for that, but sort of pulling out the highlights. A bit on the extensions that were proposed in a separate W3C specification that I wrote. And then at the end, I'm going to talk just a bit about how SOSA and the SSN extensions are being implemented currently by TERN, the Australian Terrestrial Ecosystems Research Network, also in collaboration with our Federal Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. So this is sort of the evidence of, this is not just theoretical, this is really being implemented. So the origin story of SOSA and SSN extensions actually goes back to some work that we did in the OGC 20 years ago now. It started, and it was a little bit in the aftermath of 9/11, actually, when there was interest in some environmental observations and even security observations and surveillance observations. Sort of coming out of that homeland security obsession, but the sort of the real sort of stepping back and thinking from a science point of view, we observed that we have a number of regimes, particularly in the sort of earth and space sciences, where we make observations, but we use slightly different terminologies to refer to aspects of those observations. So remote sensing, we talk about sensors and values and parameters and scenes, and in earth science simulations, we have algorithms and simulators dealing with models or fields, about variables in volumes or grids. In metrology, which is about weights and measures, we have instruments and values and measurands. That's a good word, isn't it? And samples. Chemistry, we have instruments or analytical processes, analytes, samples. Environmental monitoring, we have sensors and time series and parameters and stations. And actually, the way I've put these in these little tables is those rows kind of all line up because they're more or less talking about the same things, which is the thing you use to make observations, the results of those observations, the parameter or variable which is being observed, and the place where the sensor is. And so what we developed with the OGC is a kind of cross-domain, cross-disciplinary terminology, which was called observations and measurements. And the words that were selected to describe are sort of in the box there, lined up in the same way as the different domain ones, but put in a sentence down in the bottom left there. So an observation is an action. The result is an estimate of the value of some property of the feature of interest. This word feature is sometimes a little bit troubling, and it comes out of the GIS world. You can possibly replace the word feature with the word entity, if you like. And it's the value that applied at the stated phenomenon time, obtained using a specified procedure, and completed, that's the observation, was completed at the recorded result time. And this was encoded in an international standard, which was basically also published as an OGC standard, has been implemented in a number of ways, including some profiles like the time series profile by OGC. I think the last talk in this series was on ODM2, and that, in fact, is pretty closely an implementation of O&M. It sort of started in a slightly separate place, but we converged it. And then so the one that I'm working with mostly these days, so the most flexible implementation is as an ontology published jointly by OGC and W3C. Which was sort of the second version of one that had been earlier published as through an incubator project, and there it got renamed into the semantic sensor network ontology. Actually, the network bit kind of has fallen out of it, but it's based on semantics and ultimately is implementing the O&M model. And the O&M model, using almost the same terminology as in those little tabulations I was showing before, but we can represent it as this kind of graphical schema where the word observation applies to an act of observation. Sometimes in sets of results you see observation, you actually see the value. Here we refer to that as the result. So you see all those words as made by sensor, phenomenon, time, result, time, used procedure, is about an observed property related to a feature of interest. And basically, if you've got all of this information, you've got when it comes down to it is the metadata and the result for a single observation. Now, it doesn't, because it's implemented as an ontology, doesn't mean you will actually have all of this detail directly attached to every observation, but this is the conceptual model for how the information would be related if you ran all your reasoning and ran all your inferences and got all the data about each individual observation. Because the result can be a lot of different things. I'll go into more detail than in a moment. But the problem ultimately that we think we solved by addressing it this way was that we can describe many types of observation using the same language. And the types of, quote, observation include in situ observations, that's monitoring and field observations, ex situ observations, where you take something, take it to a lab and run it through a machine that goes ping, and remote sensing observations. Those were the spatial relationships around that, which I'll go into more detail in a moment, was of a lot of interest in the geospatial community where this work started. And the other aspect of it, which is important, is it's got a lot of flexibility about time, particular in being able to manage using just exactly the same language, sensor observations, forecasts, and models. So going back to the location bit, you'll notice there is no location for an observation, but there are things associated with the observation that will have locations. In particular, the sensor will be located somewhere, and the feature of interest or the entity of interest regarding which the observation is being made will have a location. And by mixing and matching different combinations of locations of sensor and feature of interest, you can handle in situ observations where the sensor and the feature of interest have the same location, ex situ observations where the sensor is in a lab and the feature of interest is in the field, remote sensing observations where the sensor is on a plane or a satellite concerning some scene or some part of the landscape which is remotely separated from it, that being the feature of interest. And the other bit that I mentioned is looking at different ways in which you can mix and match the temporal properties. You notice I've highlighted here two different times, the phenomenon time and the result time. The phenomenon time is the time that the result applies to the entity, whereas the result time is the time the result becomes available after all data processing has happened, which may be quite a different time to when the sensor stimulus happened. And they're separated in the model, and when you look at ways in which they can be combined, sensor observations, the result time is always later than the phenomenon time. The result is, always either the same or later. The result does not become available until shortly after the sensor was stimulated. With forecasts, the result is generated before the numbers are claimed to apply in the field. You just saw my little thing telling me that I've got to take some exercises, but we'll try and ignore that for the moment. This is our parental organization taking care of our health and safety. So forecasts have a result which is before the time where the phenomenon applies in the world, and then in cases like archaeology, geology, and cosmology, you'll have a result time which may be many, many millions of years after the phenomenon was or billions of years even after the phenomenon applied in the world. So that flexibility of time and space was always an intentional part of the problem space that this model was designed to address. And then you've got other things, which is, well, what is this result? Well, the result can be of many different types. It could be a scaled number, like, yeah, that's more or less my height. It can be a vector or a tuple, a coordinate. So, what is the result of the reading of this GPS? It's this location, okay? It could be if the sensor is a camera or a remote sensing thing, then typically, or even is an Earth simulator, the result will be an array or an image or a field. The result can be a classifier, like these rocks are Silurian, according to the International Stratigraphic Chart 2017, which is different to the International Chronostratigraphic Chart 2018 and 2019, by the way. I'm not sure that Silurian's changed, but some of the other bits have. It could be, say, an assessment, poor, according to some scale. Could be a Boolean value. So any of these result, there's a lot of different things that can be the result of an observation. And in almost all cases, you need to tie that result to a reference system. It's a value taken from a controlled vocabulary or according to some spatial reference system or some units of measure or something. That's the quick version of the observation model. Well, alongside it, from early on, we also recognized that when you're doing science in particular, actually the sampling strategies is an incredibly important part, and it certainly is in soils, but is an incredibly important part of the overall sort of process of doing science, making observations, getting numbers. And there's a lot of different kinds of sampling, in the real world, in clinical contexts, and even in social sciences, sort of population statistics contexts. And so it was only a little bit dealt with in O&M, but then when we developed the SOSA and SSN ontology, it became a much more important part of it because we introduced the notion of an act of sampling, which is similar to an act of observation. An act of sampling has a result, which is a sample, which is a sample of the feature of interest. These same words can be used, and the same topology of the model more or less applies. And it even applies in those social science contexts, those population science. If you understand, sample in this context as the result of an act of sampling. Now, in soils and in natural sciences, we often talk about specimens as well. And specimens are things that sit in shelves or in museums, are curated or accessioned, which almost always are samples, but they're ones which are managed as well. At least that's the way that I use the language. But sample is the consequence of an act of sampling. And if we focus on that, then the essential property of a sample is going to be this is a sample of relationship with thing which it is intended to characterize. And that's pretty sort of significant, I think, and is a fairly important kind of part of empirical science, and certainly in the soil space. So there's a lot of types of sample. There's material samples, which are the kind which are often turned into specimens. The statistical samples, which are basically subsets. Spatiotemporal samples, like a quadrat or and some spatiotemporal samples have got a lower topologic dimension, like you have a 2D sample of a 3D phenomenon, like a cross section or a level in a mine. So we got these two models for observations and for sampling, which basically have got the same shape. We could have a phenomenon time for sampling too, when the sample was taken. They're implemented in the SSN ontology, of which SOSA namespace is the core part of it, with all of the stuff on the screen there now. In fact, we recognize that this active observation, which generates a result, is basically very similar to a provenance sort of model. And this is a little diagram, the core model from the W3C prov model, where there is an activity and every entity is seen as being generated by that activity. And so here that was generated by is result of the activity. That this separation between the activity and the entity also pops up in BFO, where they're called occurrence and continuance. In other contexts, they're called perdurance and endurance in the ontology world. So this separation between the act and the result is quite commonly pops up in the ontology space. We can also look at a parallel from observations with some structures from schema.org. And this was where I did this diagram 2 or 3 years ago now. I think it more or less still applies, actually. There's measurement technique, variable measured, result, object is the feature of interest, instrument. So there's, we could implement the O&M model using schema.org more or less. In fact, the guys doing science at schema.org with an ESIP, basically headed that direction. The SSN namespace within the SSN SOSA stuff basically just picks up on those bits around sensor networks and deployments, which didn't have their origins in O&M. So I'm just sort of giving a nod there. I'm not going to focus on that anymore, but the notion of platform and deployment and systems comes from SSN. And I'll also just draw attention briefly to where the A comes from in SOSA. It's from actuator. So basically the idea is there's an act of actuation, and rather than making observations of the world or sampling the world, it changes the world, which is what an actuation does, opens a window or turns on a light or accelerates something. Yeah. Anyway, and just a quick example of what these things look like in an implementation. This, I think, is directly from the spec. You have a temperature observation, which is made by a temperature sensor, which is hosted on a platform, which in this case is a smartphone. We've got a formalization here, which sort of runs the whole spectrum from science through to these kinds of applications. So the extensions to SSN were picking up on some things which are pretty important to science again, which we basically ran out of time for when we did the original SSN SOSA ontology. And one of those is around the fact that the thing that we make observations on, usually a sample, is typically actually not the thing we really care about. The thing we really care about is something much bigger. And so these SSN extensions introduced the notion of an ultimate versus approximate feature of interest. It also introduced the fact that when we're doing science, we're never basing it on one observation. We're always, science is about seeing patterns in suites of observations, and the suites of observations you'll control some variables and you'll let other ones vary in order to look at what the variation of the results are, depending on what. So you have collections of observations where you're holding one thing or two things or three things or four things constant and letting another thing vary. And so I refer to those as homogeneous observation collections. We haven't yet also thought about homogeneous sample collections, but that's an obvious sort of next step as well. So, and here's a way of diagramming it, similar to the way in which I was diagramming those things before. Sometimes the feature of interest that you're making the observations on is the thing that you care about. If you're measuring the Simon's height, yeah, you'll actually take Simon and measure his height. And so the thing which you put in the tape measure against is the ultimate feature of interest, as well as being the proximate feature of interest. But more often, the thing which you make the observations on is a sample of something which is in the world, which is what you're really interested in. I'll give you a very elaborate example in a moment. And there may be a sample chain which separates the thing that you're able to make the observations on from the thing which you're actually attempting to characterize. And the similar patterns. This is going back and showing the way in which the act of sampling and the act of observation have the same topology. We see similar patterns for sampling if you introduce this idea of an ultimate feature of interest, which may be one step or two steps or three steps separated from the thing from the thing which you are sampling, the thing which you're making observations on. So here's the example that I built up. Based on my background once upon a time as a geologist, and saying, okay, so I want to characterize the Leaderville Formation, which is a sandstone bed in Western Australia. Okay, and so how do I do that? Well, first I visit an outcrop, which is actually kind of hard because it doesn't outcrop much, but there you go. And from that outcrop, I can take a sample, maybe take some core. Then we'll take an interval out of that core. Okay, and you say each time we've got a sample, which the interval is a piece of the core, which is a piece of the outcrop, which is a piece of the Leaderville Formation. So you've got this chain. And then we'll split the interval, and half of it will send off to one lab, and half of it will send off to another lab. And then in each case, it gets sieved, crushed and sieved. And then in the one case, we separate it according to using the heavy liquid and get the heavy components. And in the other lab, we separate it using magnetometer. Okay, and so sorry, not a magnetometer, magnetic separation thing, and just take the magnetic minerals. And this is not a. I haven't actually sampled the Leaderville Formation, but this is quite a reasonable, quite a plausible sort of sample processing chain. And you see at each stage, we're getting more samples, which have got a clear relationship back to the thing which we actually care about, which is the Leaderville Formation, through a chain of sample of relationships. Some of these will only exist ephemerally, more or less as soon as they've been created, that they get passed through to the next process where they get crushed or sieved or whatever. And so they never end up sitting on a shelf, but some of them will end up sitting on a shelf so that we can go back later and maybe make more observations on them after the initial observations. But it's quite powerful, having started as quite a simple model. with just this one relationship is sample of, and then a few kind of convenience relationship like has original sample and has ultimate feature of interest and has sample feature and these kinds of things. But the is sample of is the one that matters. So that's the one thing that SSN extensions does. The other thing is it's deal with collections, homogeneous collections of observations. And the model for that is just saying, well, a collection has got a whole lot of members, which may themselves be collections, but typically are going to be observations. And any or all of the procedure, the sensor, the observed property, the phenomenon time, the feature entity of interest might be shared across all members of that collection. And so we can associate the data with the collection, and then on the individual observations, we only record the things which are different. You know, the one thing that won't be shared, a bunch of observations as members of a collection, will be the results, but everything else could be shared. And an observation collection really only makes sense, otherwise it's just a bag, if at least one of those things is shared amongst the collection. And there's a couple of examples. This one is a kind of remote sensing example where we've got a bunch of observations of scenes, images for 4 scenes made by the same sensor using the same procedure of the same observed property, reflectance, at the same time. So this is basically adjacent scenes within a you know, an orbit of Terra on MODIS. Sorry, so that's tiles basically at on the same day. The same data could be decomposed this way as a time series. Now, rather than holding the time constant, which we did with the top example, now we're holding the feature of interest or entity of interest constant. So it's all of the same scene, but at different times. Okay. And each of these observations has got an image result, which is now it's a time series. Up there, it was adjacent images in the same, you know, on the same day. So that's, you know, depending on what view, you know, what it is you want to study, you may be interested in spatial variation on the same day or temporal variation in the same spatial location. And that's how it's expressed. And it gets more complicated because you can nest collections within collections. So the top, this one here has got, now we're looking at canopy cover using some procedure which is described in the Australian Soil Landscape Survey handbook made by Brenda White, whoever she is. 2 different days, one in 2017, one in 2019. But made on the same on 2 different plots, and we've got canopy cover in 2017 on plot 1 was 60%, on plot 2 was 25%, and by 2019 on plot 1 it was 75%, whereas on plot 2 it was 15%. You can see the games you can play with this. You know, here's another example, same data, but now mixed, so that we're looking at the time series for one plot and the time series for another plot versus the spatial series at 2 different times and the one above. And so the point here, you know, is just if you are wanting to do a particular study, then you're going to compose your collections in different ways, and this is this observation collection model handles it using a common patterns. And you know, the ultimate thing is that you can conceive of data sets themselves as being collections of observations. You know, that's what data sets are, at least empirical data sets. So that's the generic model, and I've given you, you know, I've given you some sort of notional examples where we sort of turned them into instances rather than just schemas. And that begs the question a little bit as to how it is that you actually do apply it to a particular application or domain. And there's a number of slots in this model where the domain-specific information is going to come in. There's going to be the protocols and procedures, it's going to be the instruments and sensors, it's going to be the object types or feature types and their observable properties. And we've already mentioned the different result types. So, I've got my sequence a bit wrong here, but so I'll just zip all the way through. This is, an example of what is a feature or an entity? Well, it's a bloody big tree, but that is an example of a vascular plant occurrence. And what are the characteristic properties of a vascular plant occurrence? Well, when it's trees, it's height, diameter at breast height, taxon, location. And for this particular example here, it's very tall, very broad, big flowering plant in Tasmania. Okay. And this is just sort of reminding you about how a model for, in this case, occurrences of vascular plants gets built up. Another aspect of it is the way in which we do the sampling. And one of the things that we built up first, this diagram is from a slightly earlier version of the TERN model, which we call Turnplot. That's where we basically introduced the idea of sites and site visits. And then a site will have a bunch of properties around that, which you do as part of an ecological survey, the organism occurrence, the taxa at the site, the strata for a particular taxon, and so on and so forth. This comes out of the practice of ecological surveys used in Australia with the terminology there, but I think it's probably not that different to what's used in lots of other places. One of the differences we do find in Australia is the number of strata that they want to count actually varies depending on what state you're in. Basically, those states which have very, very rich rainforests have lots of strata, and those states which are really, really dry, don't have very complex vegetation, don't have as many strata in there. That's the difference between Queensland and Western Australia, basically. Implemented using RDF and linked data technologies means that we use URIs for terms, we have standard resource types, we use links between different resources in the serialization from a site description to the observation collection which describes that site. For example, we have individual observations which are parts of those observation collections, and links through to data, some data types like time instance and quantitative measures and those kinds of things. So the current TERN ontology, which has been evolved from the Turnplot, is being used for data integration in a big project at the moment through the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. As I said, it's focused around observations at sites, and site is a type of sample, and in this case, a site samples an ecosystem, or samples a tract, or samples a piece of the landscape. And then there's site visits, which are where a bunch of observations or acts of sampling will take place. And some sites are established from continuous monitoring, and some sites are only just visited occasionally. Some sites are only just visited once. I just said all that, didn't I? So that, most of what is actually in the class model in the TERN ontology, and all of the rest of the domain customization is handled through controlled vocabularies, which give you the permitted values of these different variables and classes. And so TERN is managing a shitload of controlled vocabularies. There's about 80 of them at the moment. There I'm just showing you the ones beginning with CO. Each of those will have, in some cases only 2, but in some cases 200 members in those individual vocabularies. developing the members of those. We've got a bunch of books that we used in the past. We're sort of going through a process. There's something I'm working on with Megan in the soil space, but the soil space is seen as part of the overall soil and landscape space. So, some of our books spill over into the eco space. So, yeah, converting diagrams like that into lists like that is, part of the exercise we're undergoing at the moment. The most recent one, as of Monday, was it? I put this one up, maybe Tuesday, Megan, from the Australian Soil Classification. It's only in a demo server at the moment, but since I think this is still a soils group, or originally a soils group, I thought I should finish on this and say, we've got these all with URIs, with nested into orders and suborders, with detailed descriptions all hidden away under there. If you type in that URI that you can see at the top of the page there, or down at the bottom there, you'll be able to go and look at it, at least as long as I leave it on the demo server till I move it over into the production server. So my acknowledgements should have whacked Megan on for the work that she's done with the soil space with us, and I'll shut up now. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Simon. I was wondering if anyone had any questions for Simon. We've got about 15 minutes, almost a little more than 15 minutes left.
Yeah, I've got one, actually. First, I'll say, Simon, that was just a fantastic talk. I just love that. That was really wonderful and educational. I really enjoyed it. The question I have is, I don't work too much in the ontology space. So this working group is I'm learning a lot and enjoying it, but it's a lot of this is new to me. And I think it's really fantastic that you've got like these large projects, like these agencies that are using this infrastructure. I mean, I can really see the value. I guess the question I have though is, like, for your typical, like down the hall, like if you've got ecologist down the hall, do you interact with those ecologists and do you introduce them to this, and do you can you convey the value and then teach them to use these tools? And if so, how do you do that?
Yes, we do. They're not necessarily down the hall. We've all gotten used to remote collaborations. In fact, probably CSIRO was kind of ahead of the pack with that. We've been having remote distributed teams meeting by teleconference for years now. I moved from Perth to Melbourne sort of notionally in order to be closer to the people that I'm working with, but most of them are in Canberra and Brisbane anyway, and Megan's out in Western Victoria. So a lot of our interactions are through these virtual means. The big projects are important. And I mean, TERN is another organization which is basically split between Adelaide and Brisbane, but has got the contract to do this data modeling ontology work for an agency which is dominantly in Canberra. So we are, our conversations are not just in the kitchen, they're also through, having structured projects and structured meetings. In fact, the work, the science lead for the DOOR project at the moment is in Perth. Okay, so, and the facilitator is actually up the street here in Melbourne. So we regularly are having sessions with people from all over the place. But your question is very much on point, Stephen, which is around, how do we propagate these ideas, and what are the levers for these? The working with the agencies is really useful because they have a budget and they have a regulatory role, which means that the people they're working with, to a certain extent, have no choice but to go along and use the infrastructure that they're proposing. It's harder when you're working with researchers, when you're working with scientists, because the main motivation for scientists is putting out papers, right, so that they can, get their next promotion or their tenure or whatever it is. And something I talk about with my colleagues up the corridor. I've got some colleagues who work in remote sensing and bushfires, wildfire research in particular. The sort of the language I use with them is, yeah, these projects are all very well and good, and writing your reports and delivering that to your customer and that, but what have you left behind?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's the question I try and ask. Infrastructure is hard because, of course, infrastructure becomes valuable when it becomes big enough. And, you know, when you start getting more rewards back from relative to the effort that you have to put in order to move your data or your whatever it is into the infrastructure. And, you know, we can also look at the sort of efforts going on with the, you know, the science unions and the publishers and that to get people to deposit data sets into reliable repositories, you know, as part of that process of improving the infrastructure. You know, ultimately, those things actually depend on the diligence of the journal editors in enforcing that stuff, and that can be incredibly variable. You know, sneaking something through because the paper's good, even though you haven't deposited the data, is, you know, is almost the rule, whereas it should be the exception. So you know, I think we're on a bit of a journey. And, you know, like I said at the beginning of this particular theme, this piece of work, I've been working on for 20 years, okay, already. Yeah. And I don't, you know, to a certain extent, I think this door and turn implementation and the soils work that I'm working on with Megan, you know, is some of the more significant impacts. And this is coming 20 years after the work started. I was talking with soils people. I think my first session with soils people was 2004, 2005. And, you know, and still we're you know, we're in an education process here, so it doesn't happen instantly, and you know, and some of it's about tooling as well as mind share. The tooling is a whole lot easier now. You know, back in 2004, I was still working with UML and XML schema, and God, those were awful. You know, RDF's not much better, frankly. But you know, RDF's basically a matter of bringing shared definitions into JSON these days. That's what, you know, or even CSV, you know. You know, one of the things which, as being part of sort of a science community, and is we generally are aware that we're part of a global science community, and therefore terminologies, shared terminologies actually matter, which is a difference between us and what we're doing, what happens, say, in the business world. Everyone is a lot more secretive. Right. But so I don't have a single answer, Stephen, but you know, that's more kind of a flavor of the kinds of interactions we have and how we bring them along. But ask your science friends what they leave behind. Yeah. If there's anything they can leave behind, get them to think about that.
Right. So
oh, sorry, Kathy, go ahead.
I was going to build off of what Steve was talking about. I could, so a lot of this is sort of unstructured, not unstructured databases, but not rectangular data tables, which is typically how researchers think of databases. Yeah. So I was, and the information that's captured here is typically presented in both sort of methods documentation and as rectangular data tables. So have you worked, do you have a pipeline to move between a spreadsheet that a technician might deliver and then annotate that with metadata information that you collect from the project to produce this graphical database?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually what the Turn and Door project is doing right now. They're working from recognizing that, you know, the spreadsheet is the user interface, if you like. That's the tool that people have on the desktop. That's the one that we all know, you know, more or less how to use. And so now, you know, in CSIRO, we have some awesome corporate stuff that we have to fill out for project budgets and leave requests and that, which under the hood is all Excel spreadsheets, but you know, with lots of scripting on top. you know, and drop downs, and you can't type in this field, but you can type in that field and all that. And you know, realistically, I think that's likely to be, well, it's either going to be those or it's going to be web forms, and actually those things are merging together anyway through platforms like Teams and Google Sheets and those kinds of things anyway. But you know, we've also got big legacy data sets, which typically are rectangular, and legacy doesn't mean old and worthless, means incredibly valuable. And for God's sake, let's not imagine that we are going to go and recollect that data. You know, we need to make it reusable. An awful lot about this, you know, I've sort of flipped back to before a couple of times. I've shown representations of actual data in the actual graph or RDF format, but frankly, you know, I don't want to play that up too much. It's more the conceptual models which are important here, you know, and saying, all right, this language that we've introduced through O&M and SOSA and SSN, using words like procedure and result and, you know, phenomenon time and result time and these kinds of things, they're not domain specific, but they're not weird. You know, they're actually useful. It's a useful shared terminology which allows us to share data, particularly share data across discipline boundaries, which, you know, I mean, SERLS is pretty interdisciplinary space.
We like to think so.
With geology and biology and chemistry and all these things. So talking across discipline boundaries is pretty much par for the course, isn't it? So if we can just, you know, have these conceptual models through which we can view or represent or interpret the data that we already have is really, you know, maybe all that we're asking for. Now, you know, the TERN and DOOR people actually are transforming the data and are using a graph database as a data warehouse. Okay, and that's a bold thing, but it's also it's actually easier than just about any other way to create a data warehouse, or at least an interoperable, you know, queryable data warehouse of the data that they've got. So it's it is bold. You know, they're not going to be leaving it in rectangular form. The idea is they're transforming it into the graph database, where it will be able to be sucked out into rectangular forms for people to have on their desktop for doing their science, doing their analysis. But the underlying data store is actually going to be a graph database, following these kinds of models. So, and really, I suppose what I was, you know, the story of what I was showing here was, and these models are competent to describe a wide variety of data sets. Once you've got a small extra ontology, which talks about sites and site visits, and you've got a whole bunch of controlled vocabularies.
I have a question.
Hey, Brandon.
Do you think, in your experience, have you found that the sort of notion of working with reasoners, right? So we talk about in your presentation, it's a lot about the semantics of the terms and values that we tag data with, right? And being able to understand what's being shared, right? And I was always infatuated with this idea that we might find new, you know, scientific discovery, not just resource discovery, if you like, from an information retrieval perspective. And I was wondering if you had any experience or any comments on that. That realization of reasoner. Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
We had one bad experience.
Okay.
Where we tried to build a big graph database in one go, with not enough testing along the way, and, you know, with the fantasy that we were going to get all the ontologies right first time, and tried to slurp it up, and a week later the reasoners were still running, and we just Okay, and it's because, you know, I mean, it was very, I wasn't involved in hitting the go button. I would have done a shitload of testing first, but it was, I tend to focus more on the queryability, Brandon, the queries rather than the reasoning. Reasoning's bloody hard because those inconsistencies can pop up in places where we hadn't anticipated. And you know, you really have to start small and build up. I know that the reasoners have been used very successfully in the biomedical sphere. Well, actually, it's hard to tell from a distance how successfully, but there's a big community around, particularly the OBO sort of foundry stuff. And there the argument strongly is the only way they could possibly deal with these thousands of gene ontology stuff, and that is by automating a bunch of reasoning and a bunch of sort of validation checks based on reasoners over the top of that. So obviously it's working well there. That's more about validation than creation of knowledge. Okay, I think that's how they're using it there. So the creation of knowledge just seems to be very brittle. It's a great idea, but it's really hard to make sure that everything, all the schemas are consistent with each other. Really is what needs. It's really but writing the queries here is really easy. You know, I as part of the DOOR project, I basically had to just say, all you need is this wildcard through these sample off chains. You know, they want to know if this particular eucalypt, which sites it has been observed in. I say, well, you know, it's easy. You just have a Sparkle query that's got an is sample of star in there, right? And you know, those kinds of queries, because joins and databases are a pain in the arse, and having an undefined number of hops along an is sample of chain is not that easy using the conventional technology. Is really easy with graphs.
So that's actually one of the reasons why I asked, because I think it was on your slide 20. You had that layout, right, of your sample, what you're just talking about, I think, right?
Yeah.
And for me, when I looked at that slide, especially in dealing with, within the context of sort of soil taxonomies, right, and the differing opinions or ways to characterize something, right? And what you actually, I think, are, in my view, we are looking at, one of the ways is if you sort of flip all the arrows around, you're looking at, I suppose it's sort of an epistemological characterization of a class, right? Yeah. So you're saying, well, I've generated this class, and these are all the data points that sort of enforce that or realize the definition. And anyway, so within the context of multiple soil taxonomies, being able to hit a data set like that you've shown and say, well, I can overlay any description on there and view a map, let's say, in using any classifier. That's one of the reasons why, and then how that links into maybe that's really interesting.
So I'd focus on the queryability rather than the reasoning. Reasoning may come down the track, but I think that's been overpromised.
No, fair enough. That aligns with my experience as well. I just was curious, so thanks for that. Sorry, I droned on a bit. We're at the end of the hour. If there are any other questions, does anybody have one more question?
I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.
Thanks, Kathy.